So today we're very, very lucky to have Dr. Zach Bush with us as our special guest. And Zach's compelling body of work explores how nature connectedness and human health are intrinsically linked. And this is a sentiment that really resonates with the work that we do at SUGi. With a background in academia and medicine, particularly chronic disease, Zach has moved towards a more nature driven perspective on health that really focuses on the ways in which we engage with and nurture the living systems around us and how these living systems nurture us in return. So it's a hot topic and lots to it. So a quick note, we're going to move through the conversation and then we're going to do a Q&A towards the end of the conversation. So I really welcome everyone to find that little box and ask your questions and we'll try and answer all of them as best we can. But first, I would like to introduce you to Elise, SUGi's founder, and she's going to have a few words and then we'll get into it. So Elise, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Anya. Zach, first of all, welcome to you. I mean, it's an absolute honor to have you with us today. I've personally been following your work for a long time, and also ever since I purchased the ION gut support. But at that time, SUGi didn't exist, so no. I mean, little did I know that one day we'd be sitting here and hosting a webinar with you. So I'd like to think of the invisible thread that connects us all. So thank you. And yeah, what an incredible group. I'm just looking at the chat, and I do think we're covering the four corners of the world. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So before we dive into biodiversity, its health with Zach and Anya, I just wanted to give a little more information about SUGi. So SUGi is a grassroots movement, and it was really born out of a desire to bring the wild to where we live and work. And we do that through the creation of ultra-dense, biodiverse pocket forests of native species only. We transform spaces and in some instances quite literally break up the concrete. So you can see that one behind me. And we transform that into thriving micro ecosystems. So together with our global network of expert forest makers and the communities on the ground, we restore the web of life. Today, 260 pocket forests are thriving across 28 countries, and that goes from Beirut to Los Angeles and Sao Paulo to Cape Town. And each forest becomes this testament to ecological and social renewal. I like to call them magnets for human connection. And in London, we recently conducted a pilot study with the University of Oxford, and that was led by Kathy Willis. And the goal of this study was to understand the physiological and psychological benefits of spending time with wild urban nature. And participants spent time, with a control site and with a pocket forest. And the results were really clear. 30 minutes with a pocket forest boosts significantly mental health and well-being. So with that, Zach, I'm excited to learn more about your take on the vital role of biodiversity in our lives. Thank you.
Grateful to be with you all. It's a wonderful topic, and I'm so grateful for the work you're doing. Thank you for 240 forests in the world. I appreciate that.
Amazing. Well, I thought a good place to thank you, Elise. That was lovely. I thought a good place to start would be to ask you how you got here. What was the inciting incident or maybe series of events that made you pivot from a more clinical approach to medicine? Would that be correct, to a more nature-driven perspective?
Yeah, it was a series of events over about a decade that kind of got me out of the ICU. So I was internal medicine trained as a medical doc, and so spent most of my time in hospitals doing tertiary care with a referral center that was had a catchment area of 800 miles or something like that. So area hospitals and clinics were sending their patients to this large university hospital in Virginia. And before that, I was at University of Colorado in the Health Sciences Center there. So was used to seeing kind of the most severe, versions of disease and managing mostly unconscious patients. And so patients kind of in the most severe state of physiologic stress, brain not functioning, and organ systems shutting down. And so I did that for years and got to see our ability with technology to patch things up at times and get people back out of the hospital, and witnessed that even in those best of moments, those patients were back, within weeks or months, typically with worse conditions than they had been in before. And so watching that slippery slope of chronic disease gave me, a root desire to move upstream to try to become part of an effort that would prevent the disease rather than create the disease. And so I went into endocrinology and metabolism as a second subspecialty. And endocrinology is studying the way in which the communication network of the body coordinates life. And that became interesting on the front end with studying things like thyroid disease and diabetes and bone disease. But what it quickly led to, this was in the mid 2000s. So by 2004, 2005, we were starting to realize that the microbiome was having a huge influence on the human body. And the microbiome is popularized in our common thought as being the bacteria and fungi that live inside of the gut. But in fact, every organ system has bacteria, fungi that are participating in their function. Even the brain is surrounded by specific bacteria and fungi, the breast tissue, the prostate tissue. So there's healthy microbiome, there's healthy soil system throughout the entire body that lives outside of the human cells and nourishes the system, providing nutrients, providing communication network. Then you get into a 10x phenomenon with the mitochondria. And so my research as an endocrinology and metabolism expert got more and more into the mitochondrial side, metabolism being the description of the way in which mitochondria liberate energy for the human body. And mitochondria are these tiny little bacteria that live inside the human cells. And so you have microbiome outside the cells, bacteria, fungi, and the like, and you have microbiome inside the cells, mitochondria. And inside the cells, a typical human cell will have 200 mitochondria living inside of it, each single cell. And so a single human cell, something like a gut cell, for example, you're about half the width of a human hair. And so if you can imagine 200 bacteria living inside of that tiny little cell, and they're manufacturing all kinds of information and communication and nutrients, as well as the ATP and energy that the system runs on. And so your body is literally an organic garden functioning. And at this point, I was studying cancer and developing chemotherapy. I was increasingly impressed with the possibility that we could actually nourish cells instead of try to poison cells to get them into health. And so watching cancer cells dissolve underneath nutrients rather than poisons was kind of a new era. And so I developed a vitamin A compound as a chemotherapy agent and saw that go to clinical trial, and then saw the pharmaceutical industry kind of shut that research down through blocking patents and a number of different kind of market strategies, and realized that the system that keeps our Western medicine machine going has become so abstract that it can't even recognize the opportunity for health. It doesn't have an economic mechanism to recognize it. It doesn't have a science mechanism. And so when we start to really offer health as an alternative to disease management, the system doesn't know how to integrate it, doesn't, and so it just blocks it. It feels like a threat rather than a solution. So that got me leaving the university and starting my own integrative medicine clinic in 2010. And that quickly got me, looking deeper into nutrition as the foundation of health. And so we started as a nutrition center for reversing chronic disease through food systems. That got me deeper and deeper into a plant-based diet and looking at the power of medicine within plants, which was 5,000 years of Chinese medicine. I absorbed a Chinese medicine clinic with Chinese traditional herbals and acupuncture. All of that was starting to give me a much more holistic, viewpoint on how human biology occurs. So it was a long, winding path, kind of between 2005, 2015, that opened up a lot of different doors. By that time, by 2015, I'd started a biotech company that was really focused on soil nutrients and soil extracts from the microbiome of fossil soils as a mechanism to repair the human gut, immune system, neurologic system, and the like. And so that became a product line called ION. Intelligence of Nature is the website, and the product line is the acronym ION. And so Intelligence of Nature really was a body of science that came out of that work, realizing that nature's really never allowed an injury to occur that she didn't already have a solution for. And the microbiome seems to be the gift of nature that's really providing that grace to all living systems of nourishment to the point of repair. And so this regenerative capacity within a human body, within a farm field, within large macro ecosystems, all comes back to this nourishment capacity of the microbiome.
That there's so much in there that I want to dive into. Just the fact that our human bodies are these infinite ecosystems, these infinite worlds is so powerful to even think about that in the context of health. I wanted to come to the more grimmer aspect of the world first, and then we're going to go into the granular aspects. So we are living in an era of chronic disease. How did we get here, and what does that mean? How did we get here, and how is this working in tandem with the degradation of the environment? It's a big question, I know, but we're going to go to this bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly where my research has been for the last 15 years. So we can answer that pretty specifically. So my laboratory has specialized in the science of herbicides and understanding how chemical agriculture has created the chronic disease epidemic. Chronic disease epidemic really took hold in the 1990s. We've certainly had, for the last couple hundred years, a common phenomenon, something like cardiovascular disease and heart attacks and cancer and things like this. But they were affecting a relatively small percentage of young people, and we were seeing this dynamic shift by the 1990s and 2000s of cancers occurring earlier and earlier in life, to the point that we had children at age 2 developing osteosarcoma, which was a disease that was typically seen in 80-year-olds, in the 1970s. And so to take a disease that should take 80 years to become vulnerable to occurring in a 2-year-old, it was pointing to a fundamental change in human biology. And so this is really, ended up working out the chronic disease mechanism that you're pointing to. So 1970s, we roll out large agricultural resources in the form of Roundup, which is a common herbicide. Its functional ingredient is glyphosate, which has been more in the news in the last 2 weeks than it has maybe in all of history combined. But glyphosate is a organophosphate salt that's used to kill anything green, anything alive in some ways. And so what it does is it interrupts the enzymes that allow for bacteria, fungi, and plants to make the building blocks of life. The building blocks of life are very similar to the alphabet that builds all of our English language, for example. And so we have 26 letters, and you've got this fundamental situation of the vowels. The 5 vowels of the English language are known to be required for every single word to function. In the same way, every single protein that makes any single living system work relies on just 22 letters. And so the 22 letters are the amino acids. And there's 9 essential amino acids that basically function as the vowels. And so these are the critical ones. And interestingly, the essential amino acids cannot be produced by most life forms. And so earthworms and humans cannot produce these essential amino acids. We rely on bacteria and fungi and some plants to produce these essential amino acids for us. And so we have to get this from our food chain or from our gut microbiome. And so those essential amino acids have a subset of them that are directly targeted by glyphosate. And so glyphosate works to kill anything you spray it on because it disrupts the ability of these essential amino acids to exist. And so if you can't make the essential amino acids, you start misspelling proteins. And when you misspell a protein, you lose function and efficacy of detoxification, repair, regeneration, nutrification, all of these things. And so the whole system starts to sludge down slower and slower as you start misspelling proteins. Misspelled proteins also have a tendency to misfold, and a misfolded protein accumulates in the body as kind of a taxation of life. And so it's similar to having storage units. You've got a bunch of junk in your house. You're like, I got too much stuff. I need to go put some in a storage unit. Pretty soon you have all these storage units that are draining your pocketbook, and they're not useful. You're not actually going to the storage unit and pulling stuff out. You should have just thrown that stuff away. And so in the same way, the cell starts to store a bunch of stuff that's useless, more or less trash for the cell, and that burden increases. And so as we started to expose humans to glyphosate in the 1970s and in huge amounts in the 1990s through the innovation of genetically modified food systems, genetically modified corn, soybean, etc., were genetically modified so that Roundup could be sprayed directly on the crop. Previous to GMO, if you sprayed Roundup on the corn, it would be dead just as the weed next to it. With the innovation of genetic modification, we were able to spray the entire field with a chemical herbicide and only the weeds would die. So this was a massive boom for farmers that were lacking, workforce, lacking labor, and were relying on smaller and smaller margins for their crop harvest. These guys, took this up very quickly in the 1990s, early 2000s, and by 2005 we saw, a collapse of the soil systems. And so now, for a farm to stay alive, they were having to do chemical inputs at massive volumes to keep the soil productive. And so this got the farmers into a deep trap of codependence of chemicals. Cancer is pretty much at the bottom of the biologic metabolic cascade. You have to have lost about 80% of your metabolic capacity before cancer can occur. And so when we measure this in clinic, optimal mitochondrial function has a measure of what's called a phase angle. Optimal is around 10. When the individual gets down to a phase angle of 4, cancer starts to become very prevalent, and it can be any number of cancers. At a phase angle of 3.5, the individual dies. And so you can, in that metric, you get to see that cancer doesn't actually appear until you've lost almost all of the energy necessary to stay alive. Death at 3.5, cancer around 4, 4.5, somewhere in there. And so when we start to see cancer occurring in children and everything else, we can realize, wow, we lost the mitochondrial reserve of the population, specifically these individuals that are presenting with cancer at a very early age. And so we used to see those declines in metabolism at age 80. That's now happening in a 2-year-old. So this is the terrifying thing about this herbicide, kind of deluge that we've been under. Globally, we use about 4 billion pounds of glyphosate a year now. And so we're poisoning the energetic capacity of life to occur. And for that, the chronic disease epidemic just keeps growing and growing and growing at younger and younger ages.
And in turn, a lot of the biodiversity within soil is being degraded too, and that has a knock-on effect in carbon capture and all these. It's an ongoing thing too. So I wanted to touch back because I've heard you describe the body as not just a collection of organs, but as an ecosystem. And I think it's really interesting that in modern medicine, we often treat symptoms. And even with the mental health crisis, there's a medicalization of human suffering when often it's like, is there secure housing? Can people survive? What's their daily lives look like? How do we feel? Do we feel safe? So I think in medicine, often our issues are looked at as separate from our environment. And if the body is an ecosystem constantly interacting with the environment, what does it mean to be truly healthy in an environment or a system that isn't very nurturing of that? It's a big
Yeah.
question too. So
Yeah, exactly. So the exciting thing again is that nature's never allowed an injury that she doesn't have a solution for. And so as we start to see this chronic disease epidemic, explode, and we're all facing it in our own homes, every single household is dealing with one of the conditions I just mentioned. And so the weight of disease now is so prevalent that we're all having to deal with this situation. And what we found in 2012 in my laboratory was that the small carbon molecules made by soil microbes reverse the damage of glyphosate and the mitochondrial function downstream of that within minutes. And so it was an incredible discovery. Even before we'd completely untangled all of the detrimental effects of glyphosate, every time we did a study with glyphosate, we were now putting these soil extracts next to the experiment. And what we could see is that as long as there was intact soil microbiome present, the glyphosate could do no harm. In fact, the injury of glyphosate was making the organism stronger, not weaker, if it was connected to the soil microbiome communication network there. So that's the excitement that I have for the world, is that, what we found in ION is that nature has promised that as long as we stay near her, as long as we stay integrated, she will take care of us. She's got whatever stressor comes our way, she's got a solution for. The reason she's been unable to nourish us in these last few decades is we separated ourselves from that, inherent connection to nature. And so what your studies have done at SUGi has been showing that just 30 minutes standing in front of, a contained forest system is enough to improve neurologic outcomes. And so you're improving mental health, you're improving, serotonin, dopamine levels, most of which, by the way, are made in the gut. 90% of the serotonin made in a human body is made in the gut lining. And so that gut microbiome is interacting directly with the surface of the gut to produce these neurotransmitters that prevent depression, anxiety disorders, improve sleep quality, improve sex drive, all these important qualities of being alive. And so that is really the promise of nature, is that you can't be you can't be harmed as long as you stay in the fold. If you go and isolate yourself from nature, then I can't help you, and you're going to experience increasing chaos in the system, and depletion of nutrients, depletion of repair, regeneration, depletion of your proteins, your enzymes, your detox, and you're going to accumulate disease very quickly. So that's exactly how it's unfolded for 8 billion people on the planet now. Every single continent is affected, but you can see its direct effect to our food system very clearly. I just was in China a few days ago, and China produces most of the glyphosate in the world, but it remains as a culture pretty connected to its original food system, and recipes and home food preparation is all still kind of the normal for most Chinese households. The rate of obesity in China is a fraction of what it is in the United States. And so it was, incredible to watch, to fly from China back to the US. US consumes most of the glyphosate, that China makes. In some ways, we're at least in their top 5. Brazil, I think, is number 1 right now. But we buy so much glyphosate, and that's why it's been in the news recently, as Donald Trump has announced that he thinks it's a national emergency that the United States starts making its own glyphosate because we're so too dependent on China. And so it's ironic when countries decide that it's a homeland security issue to make more poison at home. And so this is the inversion of sense that happens in our economies, and inversion of sense that makes, that creates our food system today. But nonetheless, it's so exciting that nature, once integrated, protects everything, repairs everything, regenerates. The injury is an opportunity for repair, not a problem. And so that's really the promise that you guys are rolling out at SUGi, is let's start integrating nature back into these urban systems. Let's start getting our built systems of our built world to integrate for that daily human life, to be constantly exposed to a piece of nature. And by that constant exposure, we accelerate our repair, our regeneration, our detoxification, such that an abundant toxin like glyphosate becomes less and less of an issue.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. A lot of what SUGi does with the Miyawaki method is to restore the soil, and that leads to a whole wealth of biodiversity that really impacts people and their nervous systems. I know we've just talked a lot about soil, and I want to stay on this subject. But how did soil really become central in your understanding of human biology and that link? Is it purely through digestion, or is it in the environment?
So the exposure to the microbiome is happening constantly across all systems. And so the microbiome is, like I said, it's integrated inside of cells. So every single plant cell is full of plant plastids. These are famous for something called chlorophyll, makes the green stuff in a plant, but it also has mitochondria in there, has many other small microbiomes sitting inside the cell of a plant. You move them to an earthworm or a dog or a human, every single one of those cells is teeming with life. And so you're connected internally through the mitochondrial microbiome. Mitochondria are reproducing and they're diversifying constantly inside of every cell. And so the speed at which mitochondria change their genetic expression is faster than any other bacterium in nature. And so they're constantly iterating, and a single cell could have 50 or more different genetic variations of that microbiome. So there's biodiversity inside of every single cell. Outside that cell, then you have this constant connection that happens through breath, through touch, through eating, obviously. And so anytime you are interacting with any element of nature, you're exchanging bacteria, fungi, yeast, protozoa, and it's moving between systems quite readily. And so nature deficit disorder really lies at the foundation of all of this. You had mentioned earlier, Western medicine is chasing symptoms. Not only are we chasing symptoms, we're chasing disease, which are also symptoms of this, deeper wound of nature deficit disorder. And so once we come to the realization that there's only one disease, and that's disconnect from nature, we stay integrated with nature, then disease becomes obsolete. We integrate information, energy so quickly, and we're nourished so thoroughly that disease can't happen. Every cell has the capacity to replace itself with a stem cell. Every cell has a capacity to do apoptosis, to remove senescent cells that are kind of lost their regenerative capacity. So we can do cellular, recreation of every organ system through life if we stay heavily connected to nature. And I can feel it in my own body. I just did all this international travel. My body is so depleted compared to where I had been a couple of weeks ago before the travel. And so if I stay rooted in nature and I get out into the jungle here in Panama every day with the dog and run around, that's all it takes. 30 minutes in the jungle, 30 minutes next to one of your urban forests, your whole body is taking in the nourishment. And the microbiome is definitely part of it, but we can also get into the energetics of it too, which is exciting. But I'll leave it there for a moment.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's a constant interaction. We'll get into this wiring and this wonderful relationship that we have with nature. We've hardwired to respond to it. But if I wanted to talk maybe about like cellular intelligence, so if soil is the foundation of life and our cells are constantly communicating with their environment, how do you see cellular intelligence reflecting the larger intelligence of ecosystem?
Yeah, so this is an important question, and it gets at the question of what is intelligence ultimately and how does it occur. And so the gut microbiome is sitting on the largest interface between a human body and nature, and that's the gut lining. And so the gut lining covers about a tennis court in surface area. And so it's 10 times the surface area of your skin, for example. So you have this huge interface with the outside world through your gut lining. The gut lining starts at your mouth, goes all the way down through the esophagus, stomach, intestines to the rectum. And so that tube that runs inside of you is actually still the outside world. That's not that's still outside of the human body, if you will. The human body begins as you cross that gut membrane, and now you're into the lymphatic tissue, and then you're into the vascular system, and then the vascular system collects the blood into the liver, and the liver processes all of that, puts it back into the bloodstream. The heart distributes it to 70 trillion human cells. The human cells take that up. The nutrients are passed on to the mitochondria. The mitochondria digest all of that, turn that into energy, information, etc. And so that whole living system of the human body is integrated at that level of the gut lining, and it's interfaced with the microbiome. What was discovered in the last 10 years is that gut lining is not actually a boundary event. We thought that it was like kind of the Great Wall of China or something here, where it was like an impenetrable thing where you had to go across the cells to get into the body, etc. In the last 10 years, we found out that the brain is actually sending neurons past that gut barrier out into the lining out past the lining into the milieu or the mix of bacteria, fungi, etc. in your gut lining. And so what we've now discovered is that intelligence, or this process of intellect or thought, is coming from the interplay of bacteria and fungi putting information directly into the neurons that end up going to the brain. So the brain is collecting direct information from the microbiome. What we've been able to show in these last 10 years is that when you give somebody an antibiotic and you eliminate 80% of that workforce in that soil system, the serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, all the neurotransmitters that would make the brain function and produce an intelligent system declines. And so your risk of major depression goes up after a single 3-day course of antibiotics by 17 to 24%. 2 courses of antibiotics in 6-12 month period, your major depression risk goes up by 44%. And so it's this dramatic demonstration that intelligence and the function of a brain is directly related to the microbiome inside the human being. And that microbiome inside the human being is directly related to the macrobiome around the human being. And that's been played out in the American Gut Study, showing that the bacteria on the food that you're eating, bacteria in the food you're eating, bacteria in the air you're breathing is the very source by which you then integrate and create your microbiome diversity. So your soil relies on its interface with the greater environment around you. your soil creates all of the information that would then produce something like human intelligence. Does that answer your question? I can't remember
Yeah,
quite
absolutely.
all those aspects.
We go so granular there. I love it. Um, you know, when we think of children growing up in cities, and a lot of also what SUGi does is we work with in nature deprived areas. So we bring kids down and they plant the forest, and it's their first time that they've had their hands in dirt. So what do we lose when children grow up without that contact with living, good, biodiverse soil? What are we missing out on? There's some building blocks that aren't being met there.
I mean, in some ways, you're losing life, and so what? There's a word for it. It's called biosis. Biosis refers to the interconnected relationships that make life possible.
Mm.
Biosis is the interconnected relationships that make life possible. The more interconnected relationships you have, the more biosis you have, the more life force you have. A human being is the penultimate biotic expression of planet Earth so far. And so the anatomy of animals has been advancing over time to be able to hold more and more biodiversity in a single organism. Currently, humans hold more biodiversity than any other mammal or any other animal on the planet. And so if you look at a dog or a dolphin or any of the other mammals, our colon holds multiples of the diversity within it. And so the innovation of human was really the innovation of a container to hold more nature. And for that, you get more intelligence and you get more life force. And so humans not only are among the most intelligent animals, we're also among the most adaptive animals. And so because of our teeming life within us, we've learned to adapt to the ice fields of the Inuit up in the Arctic Circle, living there comfortably for thousands of years, to the deserts of Africa, to the jungles of Costa Rica. Humans have adapted to every single ecosystem. We can eat the most extreme variety of things and receive nourishment through them. That's all made possible by the diversity that we hold within our gut. And so when we start to raise children outside of their context of nature, we're decreasing the biosis within that child. The child is losing its biotic reservoir. As we go through life, then the more antibiotics that child is exposed to, and its continued isolation from nature as it moves from playing outside to sitting in classrooms, 8 hours a day by the time they're 6, 7 years old, that child is getting more and more nature deficit every single day. Their biotic capacity is declining with each passing year. So that's a dismal reality that we've now lived into. And our children now, by the time they're facing college, have so little neurotransmitter reservoirs that they are facing huge amounts of social stress, anxiety disorder. Most kids, now trying to go to college, so you've got 30% of them that can't make it through their first year because of sleep disorder, major depression, anxiety disorders, failure, brain fog, inability to concentrate, attention deficit. This generation is just struggling, and it got way worse with 2020. And so as we isolated kids away from each other and put them into homes and on Zoom, we again lost a massive biotic stimulation, which is contact with other humans. And so as we isolated, we lost our last connection to nature in some ways. And so that generation that got between the ages of 14 and 20 that then suddenly got isolated, we're seeing just these massive rates of mental health disorder and biologic dysfunction due to that isolation. So that's the dismal reality that we're in. And the excitement is that it takes so few minutes, like you've shown, 30 minutes in a forest to get there. After my trip to Japan, I spent a week in Japan. After China, I was in a week in Japan, in Kyoto, and the Japanese have now adopted a completely new healthcare protocol for all disorders, but certainly everything I just mentioned, the mental health stuff and all that. Their first prescription out of any clinic in Japan now is forest bathing. And so forest bathing has a beautiful Japanese word to it there, but the forest bathing is typically 2 hours in the forest with no cell phone and no other people. You're not allowed to talk. You're supposed to do it alone. Lay down in the forest and breathe. And so you're breathing in the forest for 2 hours once a week. it's having such a massive immediate effect that it's eliminating the pharmaceutical requirements for treatment of most of these diseases. And so it's just really a sign of grace that nature would devise in herself the capacity to repair and regenerate a human being in such a short amount of time, despite such vast, amounts of dissociation from that nature that we're responsible for.
It really brings home the fragility, but also the resilience of the human body and how dependent we are on our environments and each other to reaffirm a healthy way of being and a good constitution. It also reminds me of, the other forces that we're influenced by. So, there's lots of studies that talk about being near a biodiverse park. It encourages pro-social behaviors like empathy and sociability and care. And, we're exposed to each other. And it's often about the thoughts we're also thinking too. There's all these different things happening inside of us. So I wanted to maybe touch on neurology and psychology. You talked a lot about SUGi's a partnership with Oxford University, but what are some of the ways that human beings are wired to respond to nature? What's actually happening in the brain when we're immersed in a living system like a forest, like a biodiverse forest, particularly?
Yeah, so the microbiome is updating itself very quickly. And so with every breath you take, you're updating billions of microbes are entering the system. And so they're entering in your oral pharynx and they're informing your lungs, they're informing your gut, informing your eye mucosa, the nasal mucosa and sinuses, like everything that's touching it. The skin is updating itself. So the microbiome is present in the air in a beautiful way. And the more you touch nature, the faster it all happens. And so, like you said, a child getting its hands into the soil, updating. So there's the microbiome piece, but this is maybe an opportunity for us to shift gears to this energetic phenomenon. So the energetics of nature are every bit as exciting and every bit as critical to life as the kind of biotic portions here. So energetic versus biotic. So biotic, you're talking about the interrelated species interconnecting and nourishing. Energetic, you're talking about basically the diversity of frequencies. And so this is basically the difference between somebody sitting there and beating a snare drum alone, and it sounds monotonous and annoying, versus that snare drum being integrated into a symphony, and the symphony suddenly makes that drum make sense, and that snare drum starts to become part of something that's so stimulating and nourishing to the neurology of the brain. So the symphony of life in some ways is being played at the energetic level. And so you got the biotic force producing the nourishment, the nutrients, the communication, and then you have the energetics that's really creating the song. It's the expression of nature in so many ways. And this is the difference between being stuck on Zoom with you versus, sitting at dinner with you. And, you put two humans in candlelight or around a fire, and suddenly the whole dynamics are changed. And we've been telling story by fireside for 300,000 years. And so there's something about the energetics of fire, air, humans that elevates the experience radically. It's palpable and it creates a much more potent imprint. And so this capacity for us to really begin to remember that life is not just biotic, it's also energetic, really starts to help us deeper understand how forest bathing or 30 minutes with your forest in an urban setting can really radically change the experience, because you're actually listening to the tones of trees, bushes, grasses, wildflowers, and the soil itself, the microbiome in the soil, the root systems. So life is putting out all of these different frequencies of information that can be felt rather than heard. And so you're feeling the symphony of a forest when you sit there for 30 minutes quietly. It is important to get rid of cell phone and things like that when you're getting the deeper experience of this, because every time we add a digital frequency in here, we disrupt the symphony. And so these digital frequencies that we're putting in through the 5G network and all of this are overwhelming the system with snare drum. There's too much drum, you got to shut that down and let the violin come in, let the cello come in, let the piano come in. You got to let these other pieces come in, and we have to decrease the noise of our technologic, overwhelm for us to be able to start to really experience the full force of that symphony.
That's gorgeous. It also reminds me of Lucy Jones talking about how our eyes are wired to respond to the fractals in flowers, and that might be part of the reason that we protect them and they're so important for our environment. But it's such a beautiful thing to remind ourselves of that symphony and what it does for us, like mentally and physically. Um, so Sugi's work also specializes, yeah, you know this by now, the Miyawaki method, and we invite the community down to be part of planting a pocket forest that directly benefits them particularly. And Miyawaki developed that methodology because he wanted to target this separation from nature. And I think one thing that's really, and I can say it from my perspective of being part of forest planting exercises where you get your hands in the dirt, you plant some trees, and then you watch it grow. And when you walk by it instills you with a sense of pride. You were there with people. It's a memory that's imprinted, and you've also impacted a landscape and helped nourish a whole world underneath the soil that has a knock-on effect. So it kind of evokes lots of thoughts about the interconnection of life and how much we can contribute to the world. So what's your view of these kind of interventions for in order to make us feel invested in the environment?
Yeah, I think we could point to the blue zones as maybe,
Mm,
a potency of this. So the blue zones are scattered around the world, and in these few places of the earth, we see people living past 100 years of age quite frequently. And the blue zones we've studied quite extensively, thinking, well, they must all eat the same food, or what's the nourishment secret? What's the lifestyle? And interestingly, it's really come down to only one phenomenon that's measurable that seems to play out in every single blue zone, which is multi-generational connection. And so if you've got elders with children and specifically at a meal or in nature, and so if you have nature activities or a meal shared by 3 or 4 generations of peoples, you get this massive longevity effect. And that plays out over, like I said, almost every culture and uh, continent has one of these blue zones on it. And so the fact that this plays out so consistently is really exciting. And so when we create these experiences in nature with multi-generational connection, and importantly with strangers, this was taught to me by a couple from Icaria, Greece, which is one of the blue zones. And they had to come over to the United States to prepare a traditional Greek meal for this group of speakers at a big nutrition conference. And they had prepared this 5-course Greek meal, and we ate it the night before the conference started. And we were all in tears multiple times over the experience of consuming this meal because we had, as Westerners, really forgotten that it was possible to eat like this. One course was actually a baby onion that had been picked from backyard gardens around Northern Virginia. So they had
mm,
spent 3 days foraging around,
mm,
Virginia, which is difficult now because very few Americans grow their own gardens now. But they had foraged backyard gardens until they had found ingredients for all of their courses of this meal. And one of them was these baby onions. And it was a baby onion that had been simply roasted in the oven with a sprinkle of the sea salt and the olive oil that they produce at their own farm there in Icaria. And so it's a 500, it's been in the family for 500 years, this little orchard. And so they harvest their own olives, they press their own olive oil, they harvest the sea salt from their own coast. So it's a little bit of sea salt and a little bit of olive oil drizzled over this baby onion and roasted. And what happened in your mouth when you consumed this was beyond words. It was the memory of your grandmother. It was the
mm,
experience of nature. It was your grandfather, hand. It was
mm,
just this incredible
mm,
recollection of what it means to be alive, just eating
mm.
this little onion. And that was the experience we had to have throughout the meal. And so at the end of it, I gave this toast about the microbiome and nature connection. And it was such a great toast that I was crying. And the guy then stands up from Ikaria and he says, well, Doc, that's all very interesting, but you're completely wrong. The only reason we live longer than anyone else in Ikaria is because we always sit in an empty chair at the dining room table, hoping that somebody we don't know shows up to share our meal. And that has sat with me for the last 15 years since hearing it, with a constant reminder that I'm still missing something. It's not about the microbiome. It's not about it's about fellowship. It's about somehow connecting with another human being that you haven't known before. It's the curiosity of meeting another human being. It's the exploration and discovery of what life looks like and feels like for another human being that creates this longevity effect. And so what you guys are doing is setting that extra chair at the dinner table in some ways. You're inviting people in who haven't met each other, and you're going to create a nature experience in which they're got their hands in the soil, they're sharing story, they're hearing story, they're feeling the symphony again, they're feeling what it feels like to be biotic, interconnected relationships that make life possible. And so they are reconnecting, and they're reconnecting with strangers that are now family. By the end of that planting, I'm sure that you see all kinds of friendships emerge from that. Like now you've got this camaraderie because you planted a forest with somebody else that you didn't know. And so I'm sure you guys have generated many, many friendships within the community that wouldn't have happened without that forest moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You really see the joy on the children's faces too. It's they're just thrilled to be part of it. And I think that, as you said, this has a generational shift because you see that you were able to shape a landscape, and that's such a wonderful thing. So the name of this talk is Biodiversity is Health. If biodiversity and human health were no longer treated as separate conversations, what would the future look like?
Yeah, it's an exciting question because it's
Mm,
so gentle in its answer in some ways, and that everything will simply start to feel more like play. The
mm,
future that we're hoping for, uh, nature's never working. There's nothing in nature that works. There's no animal that gets up in the morning and is like, I got to get to work. I got to do my, I got to go to this and I got to rush off. Everybody is in slow motion in nature, and my dog is my constant reminder of this. Like Cosmo is this incredibly wonderful golden retriever. Maybe he'll come over with his name here, but um, Cosmo's got this pace of life that is a reminder that he has never woken up once to work. And his self-expression is so palpable. You know exactly what he's feeling all the time. You know exactly his joy. You know exactly how he wants to play at any given moment. And he's ready to play in a split second. He can go from like dead asleep to like ready to play in that split moment. And a squeak of his favorite ball to chase is enough to activate his entire neurologic system, and he's off and running. He's showing us something about what it will feel like to be human in a nature that is interconnected. It's not going to feel like work. We're going to stop doing abstract economies. We're going to stop doing work so we can make a paycheck. We're going to build living systems that nourish us at every level. We're going to live in homes that are so integrated with nature we don't need to go to the grocery store to buy food. We're growing our own food again. We've got clean water all of the time because it's inherent in the way in which we design a city. And so play becomes the inherent quality of a humanity that's reconnected to nature. Work goes away. Socially, I think it's important to recognize what would happen is that we will start to recognize polarity instead of polarization.
mm,
And right now, as we get separated from nature, we lose our own natural law. We get disconnected from the systems of natural law. Natural law has three fundamental, qualities to it. First law is sovereignty. So as soon as each individual within the biotic system recognizes its own sovereignty, then you recognize the second law of nature, which is the law of attraction. The law of attraction then fundamentally creates polarity. And so salt is the most perfect example of this. Sodium has never had a contract with chloride, and yet it always finds it. And sodium is quite toxic to human cells. Chloride is toxic to human cells, but sodium chloride is magical for life. And so when we find out that our difference with others is actually the thing that creates the polarity that then creates life, we will stop behaving in the ways in which we currently behave. We'll stop all war. We'll stop all economic competition. We'll start to recognize that everything is there for synergetic synthesis and synergy of interaction. And so that's what nature has taught me the most, is that the pain and suffering of humankind is not just our isolation from the forest, but it's our isolation from these laws of nature and this fundamental understanding of sovereignty, attraction, and polarity, will bring us back into a balance as we move back out into that nature and spend more time forest bathing in our urban or rural environments.
Gorgeous. That was fabulous. I'm looking forward to this world that you have in mind. So we're going to move to our Q&A now. Um, First, we have a question from Adrian, our lead forest maker at SUGi. Um, I'll start with this while I sort out the questions. So at SUGi, we always believe that a successful forest starts in the soil, the microbiome in the soil, and the connections with fungi. You've talked about mycelial connections on a cellular level. How they produce incredible results in humans. Are you able to tell us how this works? This is quite big. I'm not too sure if we already covered this, but
Can you ask that question again? Sorry, I want to make sure I catch the essence of it.
you've talked a lot about mycelial connections on a cellular level and how they produce incredible results in humans. How are you able to tell us how this works, the mechanism, maybe?
Yeah, so the way in which all systems interconnect is through redox signaling, and this is the product ion at its essence. And so when a bacteria or a fungi digests any nutrient, it creates as a side product these small carbon molecules that are capable of carrying oxygen and hydrogen combinations. And so these carbon oxygen hydrogen combinations allow for electricity to travel through liquid systems. And so whether it be the electrical communication in a human body or the electrical communication underground in the mycelial network of a forest, you're utilizing these small carbon molecules to move it. And so this is called redox chemistry. And that redox system of communication is what we were able to capture in the fossil soil and pull that forward now to this time in which all of our soils are dead. We can pull that information forward and use that communication network, that redox signaling, to reconnect the biotic, relationships inside of a human body. And so ion is this extraction of the redox signaling capacity of soils. And when we put that into a human body, we see this rate of repair and regeneration that's been missing from our last 3 or 4 generations as we killed the soil through chemical farming. And so we're reconnecting humanity to its own biotic capacity with this ion compound from nature. And our hope is, the revenues from that company we put into building Project Biome, which is a global nonprofit that is working to connect all human systems back to biotic, behaviors and natural law. And so projectbiome.org is the website there. We would love to get everybody involved there. Farmersfootprint.us is our public-facing project specific to soil and agriculture and food systems. Alana Mui is our incredible executive director out of Mexico for that project. And she's created a sub-project within Farmers Footprint called NANA that is really reminding us of the culture within agriculture. And so we've got a cookbook coming out soon, and there's think tanks and work groups within the NANA place and a community that you can join there at Farmers Footprint, where you start to realize that your interconnected relationship that happens in a daily life of culture, your lived experience of your food system, your socialization, your art, that's what actually creates the biotic capacity within a social system. And so Farmers Footprint, Project Biome, we would love for you to get involved in either of those places and start to look forward to this, state of play that we can all engage with. I'll give you one other, biotic opportunity of connection, which is ourorigin.earth. Ourorigin.earth is an event that's happening in October globally. We would love for SUGi to get involved. But it's basically a movement of movements. And October 17th, that weekend, we're doing a 3-day global event in which everybody will be streaming their own experience in to a single a hubcast. And that hubcast will create a single media production out of streaming information from all over the world. And what we will be doing is telling a new story of humanity. Humanity that's stepped right back into our birthright, which has keystone species. And by stepping into that keystone species relationship, every human becomes a biotic force. Every human has the capacity to increase the diversity of life and the vitality of life in it and around it as we step into this right relationship. And so Our Origin is a global event. It's a music festival that lasts for a couple days. We have indigenous leaders from around the world that will be leading us through ceremony and reconnection and remembrance of what it feels like to eat an onion with sea salt and olive oil. We're going to be tasting life again, and we're going to listen to the symphony of life, and we're going to sing that together. We have an anthem that is coming out for the Origin event, and the Origin anthem is the first global anthem that is imbued with the frequencies of nature. And so it's got this capacity for this regenerative capacity of heart frequency and other aspects of human biology that are imbued into the music itself. And so we're very excited for the event to carry its own therapeutic capacity in it. So that's Earth, ourorigin.earth. And so those are some ways for you guys to get engaged and stay part of this creation process with us.
That was great. That sounds lovely. So we have a question from Rasha. How does prolonged exposure to forest environments influence neuroplasticity and synaptic connectivity in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex? And to what extent can these effects be mapped to mechanisms proposed by attention restoration theory? That's a mouthful.
Thank you, Rasha, for that question. So, for everybody who's not a neuroscientist on the call, what she's asking is, what's the influence of forest bathing on parts of the brain that are responsible for memory and parts of the brain that are responsible for kind of our three-dimensional orientation of life? And I'd almost flip it around at this point. I've changed so much in my understanding of neurology as I've spent more and more time in the microbiome. But from this angle that I sit at now, it's less about the hippocampus being influenced by nature and those aspects. It's more about nature building the hippocampus. And so our neurology is the direct construction. It is being produced by the biotic influence and input of the nature inside and around us. And so when you reintegrate into nature in forest bathing or gardening or a home cooked meal from the garden, when you do this, the brain is literally being remanufactured. And so the question was around neuroplasticity, but it almost suggests that the brain exists without nature, and then nature goes in and influences it. And so we need to actually back up from that and realize the brain doesn't exist without this constant input of nature. The neurologic tree, a dendritic tree of connections that make a brain intelligent, are the neurologic expression of biosis. And so the interconnected relationships that make health possible are the same relationships that build a brain. And so there are not dendritic connections if there is not biosis happening in the gut and the nature around us. And so we need to start to remember or start to realize that there is no human brain that gets to choose, am I connected to nature or am I not? Either there's a brain that's being constantly reproduced and reconnected and re-expressed, or there's a brain that's atrophying and dying. And so the reality is, if you're not connected to the forest, your brain is losing dendritic connections and losing intelligence at a very rapid rate over the course of a lifetime. As soon as we reintegrate into nature, nature has the ability to build it again. The body is constantly being re-expressed. It is not a static thing that we can then influence this way or that way by our behavior. It's constantly disappearing and reappearing. At the atomic level, that's happening every millionth of a second. So every atom in my body disappears and reappears every millionth of a second. So 1 million times a second, 1 million times a second, I have to recreate myself from nothing. And so life is an incredible concentration of light energy because that constantly has to be producing particle out of the light energy produced by the mitochondria that is releasing all of that sunlight that we store in the chlorophyll of the plant that we then eat and release that sunlight inside of our body. So a human body could be somewhere around 10,000 times more light energy than the surface of the planet or surface of the sun. And so the sun producing 10,000 times less energy per cubic centimeter than a human body. And most of that energy is not measurable because it's turning back into particle. And so I'm recreating my tissue from nothing all of the time. And so I take light energy and turn it back into particle, light energy, more particles. So I have to reparticle a million times a second. And so I'm generating massive amounts of energy that won't ever be measured as electricity or heat. It's measured as particle. And so my brain is recreating itself a million times a second. So that's at the atomic level. At the cellular level, my brain is recreating itself, every single cell replaced every 7 years. And so every 7 years, I have to replace every single neuron in my brain. And so that's trillions of not only neurons, but dendritic connections and everything else. And so the neuroplasticity that was mentioned was referring to our understanding that the brain is plastic at every age. It can change its connections, it can learn new things, it can experience life differently at every phase of life, which is different than in the 1950s and 60s, 70s. We used to think that the brain is born and then it just ages and it can't do anything else. We now know it can reform, reshape, reconnect all the time. And that's not because we're doing something, it's because nature is expressing it again and again. So the bacteria and biosis of a human body is constantly re-expressing this neurologic tree through the stimulation of the gut lining and every other cell that's involved in the afferent nerves, efferent nerves, and the rest. And so in some ways, the answer to the question becomes quite simple, is when you step back into the forest, nature will re-express your brain, not just the hippocampus and your ability to remember, it will re-express the entire neurologic tree. And that whole neurologic tree, when rooted in the soils of the forest, is going to be so much more robust. I'll complete that thought with maybe a quick definition of consciousness. This term is being thrown around a lot in the world today: conscious communities, conscious leadership, conscious economies, conscious finance. And so a lot of people are kind of grabbing onto this, and conscious coaches, and there's an amazing amount of marketing put around this word today. But for all of that, I got pretty desperate to define the word because it was being thrown around so loosely, and it was basically othering, like, well, I'm conscious, and all of those people that don't believe in nature are unconscious, or I'm conscious because I'm a Republican or a Democrat or whatever it is. And so I was hearing it used in this very divisive methodology. And so I settled into the concept of consciousness around this simple definition, which is consciousness is the aperture through which a finite system experiences the infinite reality. The aperture through which a finite system experiences our infinite reality. And so when you start to think about going back out into the forest and its influence on a brain, you have to realize that what you're really talking about is opening up your aperture. Anytime you sit still in nature and listen, you're opening your aperture, and the amount of information and energy coming through is increasing. And the more information that's taken in, the more the brain has to process. And the more process, the more connection, the more intelligence. And so by going back out in nature, we're increasing our consciousness by opening that aperture up, and our finite system of a single human body, my perceptions, my beliefs, my preferences, my favorite thing to eat, all of that changes because I'm experiencing more of life. I'm experiencing more of the biotic intelligence of the infinite system that I sit within as a finite human being. And so we not only increase our intelligence, we increase our consciousness when we open that aperture through our interaction with nature.
Fascinating. Yeah, when you talked about the infiniteness of ourselves and the constant conversation that we're having with our environment, it does make me think of what consciousness is. Is it running through us all at every moment? So we have Tanya Quick. My husband is starting radiation treatment for a recurrence of prostate cancer, and we live in New York City. It's still winter. In your experience, what natural connections are critical for support? Organic, local foods, ion, forest bathing, getting hands in the soil, like planting a SUGi forest, camaraderie with humans, and the more than human world.
Yeah, you answered your own question very thoroughly there. So I love New York City. My daughter lives there for the last 8 years, and so I know the city well. She's on the Upper West Side up in Washington Heights around 182nd there. And not sure where you guys are located in New York City, but you have the blessing of Central Park. And so Central Park is an urban park system that's been around for the last 100 plus years. And that park system has all of the typical trappings of kind of a limited biome and things like that you would expect in anything, but it's so far beyond what most cities have. And so time in that park without a cell phone, without even other people, at least no talking. So if you go out there with your husband and spend fellowship time, which I encourage you to do, spending time out there in the park in silence, just listening. And Strawberry Fields is an area of the park that I would recommend. Like, that's maybe some of the more rewilded section of the park there. So if you go back into the kind of the briar patches and all of that over in Strawberry Fields, you'll get deeper in there. And in wintertime there, your best experience is going to be in the mornings when you get all the songbirds still there. And so you'll get quite a bit of songbird activity in the mornings there in the cold of the park. If you go from there and then the next day or on the weekend, you head out to the pier and you spend time on the ocean face there, you're going to get a completely different microbiome and sit on the pier and listen to the waves, hitting out there. Spend a weekend up in Long Island or something like that, get into the estuaries there, the egrets and all of that will be coming back in within the next probably 8 weeks. You'll start to see the migration of the egrets coming back in. And so even though you're in one of the largest cities of the world, you're so close to so much nature. You're just a couple hours from Niagara Falls, and the ion charge there in the air has incredible impact on cancer cells. And so spending a couple days at the falls where you're just sitting in front of the falls and you're not talking, you're just feeling the vibration of that force of nature that is Niagara Falls. So you're just a short drive from so much force of nature waiting to welcome you and your husband back into that reality. And what I saw over and over again in time is that we start to reframe our cancer journey when we spend more time in nature. And we start to realize that life is not about some sort of like live forever thing and heal all the disease. It's about the amount that you can feel every second. And the more times you're in nature, you're going to realize you can live a lifetime in a couple hours in the forest. You can have more feeling than you have been able to be aware of in the last 10 years in 2 hours. And so you can have 10-year experience in a 2-hour journey in nature. And that's what I would encourage you guys to do is every minute you're out in nature, you're going to live 10 times more life. And so instead of trying to live forever or cure all of our disease, we can start to embrace the opportunity for a biotic system to give us more life per second than anything that our household can experience in the confines of a drywall square building. And so getting out of the box and starting to experience nature, you're going to live more life per second than maybe you have at any other part of your adult journey. So getting plugged in out there and really running with that is exciting. If you would like to do this within the context of our clinic kind of network, we closed our clinic and left the box, if you will, with Journey. And so the Journey courses, you can access it through my website, zachbushmd.com. And through Zach Bush MD, the Journey community is a global community. We have thousands of people that have gone through the community and through the courses. And there's a couple hundred hours of health courses that are there in that cheap membership price. It's like $18 or something like that for the membership. And so I've got hundreds of hours of my content there that can help you and your husband have more and more information at your fingertips as to how you're going to do this journey differently. It sounds like this is a repeat experience for him. And so this could be a radically different journey than the first time he went through radiation or whatever the previous treatment was, if it's done in the context of these natural systems and the science of nature. And so journeyglobal.com, I think is there too, but zachbushmd.com will get you to all of the information you need on the Journey courses and the Journey community. And that's so powerful because every week you're with a group of a couple hundred people from around the world. Every Monday you're on with our coaches, and our coaches have been teaching this content for 8 or 9 years, and they can take you through much of the content. We have a completely new course content that launches towards the end of March. And so those are 4-month journeys of intense kind of immersion in this new way of understanding biology in the context of biosis, in the context of your biologic framework of nature. So Journey can be a big help to you guys as well, but I'll stop there. And there's so much information. So in Journey, you've got 11 modules. 40 hours of content that basically boiled down my last 30 years of medical science and clinical care into these simple modules that are fun to take. They're interactive. They've got, course content that's all integrated in there. And so there's a lot of self-work that gets done there. And most of the transformation really happens those first couple of weeks of the coached programs. That's where we see people really radically changing their world. They quit the job that they've been at and they start the company they've always wanted to. Or they quit their job and retire and go start, the club that they've always wanted to do, or the nonprofit that they've been dreaming of, or whatever it is. And so we usually see people, even those first couple of weeks of engagement, making the radical jump that they've always wanted to make, because they're able to see it through a different lens and they're able to reprioritize life very quickly. And so the changes tend to happen quite fast once you tap into the journey community. And when you're surrounded by people that are already on this radical transformation journey, it makes it much easier for you to cross-pollinate that information. The biotic effect of the community itself is very potent. So cancer tends to be a very lonely journey, because you don't want to tell your friends and family, because then they just project all this like fear and guilt and shame on you. And so it tends to be a very lonely journey, and Journey has made that much different, where now you have a global community, you have a new family really that's there for your transformation. They don't see the cancer as your problem, they see the cancer as your opportunity. They don't see your major depression as the problem, they see that as the opportunity. And so there's a whole community that's seeing you differently, seeing your journey differently. And so that's a resource there available for you.
Thanks, Zach. I hope that was a helpful answer for Tanya, and best of luck with everything. Sending our well wishes. We have another question here. In addition, it's anonymous. In addition to our health, do you have any thoughts on biodiversity and spiritual well-being, or any resources you'd like to point people to on that dimension of our relationship with nature?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's beautiful. I was raised as a Christian kid in a church that was started by a bunch of Teamsters out of Detroit, basically machinists and heavy labor guys out of Detroit, because they were in the 1960s watching the hippie movement and thought this is the end of our country. They don't want to work. They have no work ethics. They're all doing drugs, free sex, all this. And so they started a church to try to save the hippies. Turned out that one of those hippies was my dad, and so my dad got picked up off the streets of Boulder, Colorado, and showed up at church. Red was the guy who picked him off the street and said, "You got to come to church on Sunday, or I'm gonna crush you." And so my dad shows up there, and very quickly has his whole spiritual awakening happen in this little home church in Boulder, Colorado, and meets my mom the next day as he's walking through the dormitory of his campus as a freshman in college. And so they're 18 years old, they meet, they decide, oh my gosh, this is the divine coming. My mom had just had her Jesus moment a few weeks earlier. So I came out as a product of these two hippies that were finding their spiritual awakening in the early 70s there in Boulder, Colorado, which was kind of a nidus of change, of spirituality and transformation in and of itself, and remains that today. And so I was born in this environment, and was blessed to kind of be raised in this church over the years, and grew out of that church once I got into the ICUs, realizing that all the near-death experiences that I was witnessing wasn't fitting into the Christian box that I had been taught. And so I had this opening of the aperture through sitting at the bedside of death so often. And I became so passionate about death that I ended up being a hospice doctor. My third subspecialty after endocrinology was hospice and palliative care. And in that specialty, I was admitting 40 or 80 patients a week. I was 80 patients a week to die. And did that for 4 years alongside of my clinic. That was my integrative clinic. And so my hospice work really became one of my favorite parts of my entire career. And when you sit by, 80 patients a week as they're dying, and you're witnessing their families, you're witnessing the energy exchange between the symphony of life at this point that we call death. First of all, you find out there is no end point. There is absolutely, death is the beginning of something beautiful. It is not the end of anything. And so that's one beautiful thing that comes out of it. But the other beautiful thing that you realize is spirituality is not separate from biology. And so the question, similar to the reframing with the previous question around neurology, instead of asking what impact does nature have on the brain, we can say, we can recognize nature is actually creating the brain. In the same way, what impact does the microbiome and biodiversity have on spirituality? We can actually reframe that and realize spirituality is creating the microbiome and biodiversity and life itself. And so spirituality is, I think, a way for us to express something that is eternal and infinite in this finite system of a human being. And so as a human, I'm currently experiencing life through the lens of a finite biology, a finite neurology that's experiencing the world in a certain way. I can feel different emotions, I can feel different feelings, I can feel different sensations throughout the body all the time. And so this finite sensation of being alive is unique to my identity. And so this is the bizarre thing about life, is my identity actually at the biologic level is different than 8 billion other people, even though all of our genetics are identical. We're all human beings, Homo sapiens, all the same DNA. But my identity is fundamentally different. You can try to take my kidney and put it into any other human and it's going to be rejected. There is no perfect match. And so every other human that would receive any of my tissue would have to be immunosuppressed to be able to tolerate my kidney inside their body. In the same way, every mother has to actually blind herself to the embryo that's growing inside of her, or else her immune system will kill it immediately. And she does that through progesterone. So the ovaries on either side of the uterus produce a huge umbrella of progesterone that blinds the immune system to what's happening inside the womb. Because if she saw any other tissue in there, she would kill it. And so at the biologic level, we are spiritually unique. We have a spiritual imprint that is different than any other human being. And this is what our religious constructs have come to call a soul. There is a identity that precedes your biologic expression, and at the hospice bed, you get to watch it continue after. And so it both precedes and postcedes this biologic finite expression of a human body. That's an identity that's you. So I've got a deep conviction now in all of my science and lived experience that you are a spiritual being that's expressing a biologic finite system. It is quantum entangled with a biologic finite system. And so there is no difference between your spirituality and your human body, because you would have aborted that child instantly within those first couple hours after conception. It would have aborted if it was not intertangled with a unique identity. And that's why most miscarriages happen, is a disconnect between the spiritual and biologic connection. And so if your soul, which is a permanent structure within space-time, so what is that thing? Is it spirituality is not a woo-woo concept, it's actually a physics phenomenon. And so physics holds these different dimensional realities, these different physical geometries within space-time that are permanent. And as those geometries travel through time and space, they can intertwine, quantum entangle with physical matter. And so you could be a carrot, you could be a human, you could be a pig. You've probably been all of those. Your wife thinks you're a pig in this expression. There's this phenomenon happening that you are quantum entangling with particle as a permanent identity. So your spirituality is not only entangling, it's making possible the organization and syntropy that allows life to occur. You disentangle that and the body dissolves within hours. And so within 72 hours of a soul disentangling with a body at the end of life, that body is dissolving. It can't stay intact because the energetic form has left the body. Amazingly, that doesn't have to happen, because the biologist inside of you may be like, well, of course it declines because you don't have a heartbeat, you don't have this, so the tissue is going to rot and it's going to all come apart. So that's obvious. That doesn't have to do with the spirit. And then the Tibetans come along with their practices. So there's a practice in the Tibetan tradition that a few people even today are still training themselves into, but it takes years and years of deep meditation to achieve this state. But what's been shown is that they learn to keep their identity intertangled with their quantum body permanently. And so what happens in this, or for however long their soul decides to. And so in this situation, the individual dies, heart stops, neurology stops, the corpse is there, but the corpse does not decay. And it, kind of mummifies instead of decaying, it becomes this static expression of self. And these bodies have been studied for 50, 100 years after death now to show that the tissue is not breaking down, it's staying static. And so you can train yourself to keep your soul identity quantum entangled with that tissue, and it will remain. Most of us let go of that tissue, and the body is dissolving within 72 hours, as mentioned, and within a few months, the body is returning to its original elements. And so the Tibetans are proving to us that it takes a soul's presence, and it is the exit of the soul that determines the deterioration of its physical finite expression. And so in this bizarre way, spirituality is expressing the capacity of life to stay self-organized. And it is self-organizing. Your mother did not create you in the womb. You created yourself in the womb. She had to be blinded to the process. She didn't know if you were boy, girl. She didn't know where to put in one cell or another. She didn't know what kind of eye color you would have. She did not design you. You designed yourself from within. And that's this marriage of a soul, an infinite system, quantum entangled with a biologic potential. And the genes that you inherited from mom and dad come and express this new thing that's neither mom or dad. It's you. And that you isn't 1 + 1 = 2. It's 1 + 1 = something that's never occurred before. And neither the one or the one exists anymore. It's something completely self-expressed from that original soul. And so our spirituality is expressing our biology. And the more we interconnect with biodiversity, the more spiritual expression we get to have. And so the biology isn't impacting our spirituality as much as the spirituality is creating the biodiversity around us. And so Source is expressing itself in the beauty of a planet Earth. Tens of thousands of species of plants, hundreds of thousands of species of bacteria and fungi, all interacting to build a forest. And so spirituality is expressing nature, and our nature is the expression of Source, and we are part of that expression.
That was gorgeous. We still have lots of questions, but one last one. We have a request for a cameo for Cosmos.
Can Cosmo have a cameo? He just went outside, it looks like, so
Oh no.
I want to miss that opportunity. I'm sorry. So
good. Well, thank you so much for joining us. That was such an enlightening conversation, and I'm sorry we didn't get to answer everyone's questions, but they were really great questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Kat, and global audience. Appreciate all of you.